I threw him out like he was nothing. One second, he was standing in my living room in his cheap, wrinkled suit, and the next, he was on the sidewalk with his suitcase rolling behind him like some pathetic extra in a bad movie. I didn't even let him say goodbye to the kids. That part I regret now, but not for the reasons you'd think. And 3 weeks later, when the lawyer called to tell me that my husband's father, the man I'd just humiliated in front of 200 guests, his own son, and the entire wedding industry of Phoenix, owned half the commercial real estate in Arizona, I understood that I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. Not because I'd embarrassed him, but because he wasn't even angry. He just smiled, picked up his suitcase, and walked away like he'd been expecting it all along. But let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you know who we were before everything fell apart. My name is Jennifer. I'm 32 years old, and until 6 months ago, I had what I thought was the perfect life. I worked as a marketing director for a mid-sized tech firm in Scottsdale. The job paid well enough, not 6 figures, but solid, comfortable. The kind of job that let you take vacations and think about buying a bigger house. My fiancé Brandon was a good man, not wealthy, but stable. He worked in construction management, had a steady salary, owned his condo. We met through mutual friends at a wine bar 3 years ago, and within 6 months, we were talking about forever. By year 2, he'd proposed with a decent diamond. Not huge, but it caught the light. We set a date for June, booked the Phoenician resort, and started planning what we thought would be the best day of our lives. Brandon's father, Michael, was always a bit of a mystery. He'd divorced Brandon's mother, Linda, 15 years ago when Brandon was in college. The split had been messy, apparently. Money, infidelity, the usual suburban nightmare. Michael had moved away, kept minimal contact, sent child support, but not much else. Brandon had grown up with Linda, who remarried a nice accountant named Robert. They lived in a modest 4-bedroom in Tempe, and Linda had made peace with her life. She wasn't bitter exactly, but she wasn't warm about Michael either. When he showed up at family dinners, which wasn't often, there was this weird politeness, like everyone was performing their part in a play nobody enjoyed. Michael looked like a man who'd given up. That's the first thing you noticed about him. He was in his early 60s, but he dressed like someone who'd stopped caring in 1995. Baggy khakis, polo shirts from outlets, shoes that had seen better decades. His hair was thin and gray, and he wore it too long, like he didn't think about it. He drove an old Subaru with a dent in the side. When he spoke, it was quietly, like he was apologizing for taking up space. Brandon loved his father, but he was also embarrassed by him. I could see it in how he introduced me. "This is my dad, Michael. He works in real estate." Said like it was the least interesting thing in the world, the way you'd say someone was a mailman or something equally forgettable. The wedding planning was supposed to be magical. I'd always dreamed about it since I was a little girl. The dress, the flowers, the moment when everyone would see me as a bride. I had a vision board. I'd saved Pinterest boards since 2015. Brandon's mother, Linda, got involved immediately, which was both a blessing and a curse. She had opinions about everything. The flowers, too purple, not enough white. The seating chart. Aunt Deborah couldn't sit near the Hendersons because of some HOA dispute. The menu. Prime rib, obviously, because this was Phoenix, not Portland. She meant well, but she was exhausting. Michael, by contrast, said almost nothing. He'd shown up to the engagement dinner, sat quietly, ordered the salad, and left early. When Brandon asked him if he wanted to be involved in the planning, Michael had just shaken his head. "It's your day," he'd said. "You and Jennifer. I'll be there." That should have been a sign, but I interpreted it as respect for boundaries, not as a man who simply didn't care. Or maybe a man who knew something we didn't. The week before the wedding, things started to feel off. Not with Brandon. He was excited, nervous, sweet. He spent the night before with his best man, did the whole tradition thing. It was the other stuff. Little things that your brain catalogs but doesn't quite process. Linda started getting strange phone calls that she'd taken the other room. She'd come back red-faced and wouldn't say anything. The caterer called to ask a weird question about whether any of the guests had special dietary restrictions or financial constraints that might affect their meal choices. That was oddly specific. The venue coordinator asked Brandon if there was any possibility of unexpected family drama that might require extra security. Brandon laughed it off, but it planted a seed of unease. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 5 in the morning, which I never do, and couldn't fall back asleep. I was in my parents' house, in my childhood bedroom, and something felt wrong in a way I couldn't name. My mother came in at 6 with coffee, and I asked her if she'd noticed anything odd about Brandon's family. She'd hesitated just a fraction too long before saying, "No." "Why?" she'd asked. "Is something wrong?" I'd told her it was just nerves. But it wasn't nerves. It was something else. A vibration in the air that said the world was about to shift on its axis. At the ceremony, everything was perfect. The weather was flawless, 78 degrees, barely a cloud. The flowers were stunning, even if Linda had been right about the purple. Brandon looked handsome in his tuxedo, genuinely happy. His mother cried beautiful tears. His stepfather smiled. And then there was Michael, sitting in the third row, in a suit that fit him poorly and shoes that looked like he'd bought them on clearance at Payless. He wasn't smiling. He was just watching, with this expression that I still can't quite describe. Not sad, exactly. More like he was observing an experiment. The reception was held in the resort's grand ballroom. 200 guests, an open bar, a 7-piece band. I'd spent 18 months planning every detail. The table settings had been a nightmare. Brushed gold chargers, ivory napkins with gold trim, place cards in calligraphy. The seating chart had taken 2 weeks. I'd organized people into groups that I thought would mesh well, broken up people who might fight, strategically placed key family members. It was exhausting and stupid, and I'd loved it. Brandon's father showed up late to the reception. He'd missed cocktail hour. He was carrying a small gift bag from some generic store, the kind you grab at the last minute. He sat at the family table with Linda, Robert, and Brandon's younger sister, Katie. I noticed that people were treating him oddly, not rude, but distant, like he was a ghost that had wandered in. Nobody really talked to him. He ate his prime rib quietly, drank water, didn't dance. Then, around 9 p.m. during the father-daughter dance, Linda had a moment. She was standing near the bar, talking to some of Brandon's cousins, and I overheard her say something that froze my blood. Well, at least Michael finally showed his face, after all these years. One of the cousins asked what she meant. Linda shook her head and said, "Nothing, just old drama. Some things don't matter anymore." But her voice had this edge to it, this anger that suggested that actually, some things mattered quite a lot. I should have asked about it then. I should have pulled Brandon aside and asked him what his mother was talking about. But I didn't. I was high on happiness and champagne, and I didn't want anything to ruin the night. I wanted to stay in that bubble where everything was perfect, where the man I loved loved me back, and where nobody had secrets that might hurt us. That night, after we'd left the reception, after we'd thrown the bouquet and cut the cake and danced to our song, Brandon and I went back to the hotel suite that the resort had given us as a gift. We made love, fell asleep, and I dreamed of a man in a cheap suit walking toward me through fog. I couldn't see his face, but I knew he was angry. The next morning, we left for our honeymoon in Cabo. 2 weeks in a beachfront resort, unlimited margaritas, the kind of trip you see on Instagram. We came back tanned and happy and ready to start our new life together. Brandon had already moved most of his things into my house, a 3-bedroom, 3-bath in a nice neighborhood in Phoenix. We'd decided to rent his condo out. He said it would be a good investment, something to build wealth on. I trusted him completely. Within a month, the first sign appeared. Something small. Brandon asked me for access to my work email. "For the mortgage application," he'd said, "the lender needs to verify your income. It's easier if you just give them your login." I'd felt a twinge of discomfort. I'd never given anyone my work email password, but it seemed reasonable, so I'd done it. He'd taken a screenshot of the login page and said he'd handle the rest. 2 weeks later, he asked me to sign some documents. They were related to refinancing his condo, he'd explained. Just routine stuff. He'd left them on the kitchen counter with a post-it note. "Sign these and leave them on the table. I'll pick them up tomorrow." I'd signed them without reading them carefully. I trusted him. We were married. That's what married people did. They trusted each other. Then came the phone call from the bank. The bank called on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting in a meeting with my boss, Karen. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. I ignored it. They left a voicemail. When I listened to it during lunch, sitting alone in my car with the air conditioning running, the woman's voice was calm and professional and utterly terrifying. "Mrs. Ashley, we need to discuss some unauthorized withdrawals from your account. Several large transfers made without your authorization. Can you call us back at your earliest convenience?" My hands shook so badly I could barely dial the number back. The banker, her name was Michelle, explained it in a way that made the words seem to float past me without sticking. There had been 8 transfers over the past 6 weeks, $42,000 in total, all going to the same account, Brandon's account. Except he'd told me he was putting money into a business investment with his cousin. Except he'd asked for my work email password. Except I'd signed documents I didn't read. Except. "Are you certain these weren't authorized?" Michelle asked gently, as if she already knew the answer and was just being kind. I couldn't speak. The phone felt like it was melting in my hand. When I got home that evening, Brandon was already there. He was in the kitchen making pasta, humming something tuneless. The domesticity of it, the way he moved through the space we'd shared for 6 months, suddenly felt like a lie in motion. I stood in the doorway and watched him for almost a minute before he noticed me. "Hey, babe," he said, turning with a wooden spoon in his hand. "Rough day?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the call log, the missed call from the bank. His expression didn't change. That was the worst part. It didn't change at all. "We need to talk," I said. He set the spoon down on the counter very slowly. Then he walked to the living room and sat on the couch we'd picked out together at a showroom in Tempe, running his hand along the fabric like he was saying goodbye to it. "How much do you know?" he asked. Not, "What are you talking about?" Not, "I can explain." Just, "How much do you know?" I sat down across from him in the armchair, leaving the coffee table between us like a barrier. "The bank said 42,000 in 6 weeks, into an account with your name on it." He nodded slowly. "There's more," he said. The room tilted. "What?" "A lot more. The condo. The equity in the condo. I never refinanced it. I sold it. 3 months ago. The buyer's been paying rent to own, and I've been taking the payments." He paused. "And your house. I've been working on getting the deed transferred into my name. The documents you signed, one of them was a quitclaim deed. You signed away your ownership." I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick and poisoned. Brandon, why would you do this?" "Because my father told me to," he said. The world stopped. "What?" "My father, Michael. He came to me about a year ago, before we even got engaged. He said he had a plan to rebuild what he'd lost in the divorce from my mom. Said he needed someone on the inside of a wealthy household. Someone young, attractive, someone who could make moves without raising suspicion. He said if I did it, if I helped him, he'd set me up for life. That we'd split everything 50-50 once it was done." I stood up. My legs felt like they weren't attached to my body. "You're telling me this was planned? Before you even met me, this was—" "Not before I met you," Brandon interrupted quietly. "I didn't meet you until we were already engaged. He introduced us, at a coffee shop. He said you were the target." Those were his exact words. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed the garbage can and vomited into it. My whole body was shaking. When I came back to the living room, Brandon was still sitting on the couch, his hands folded in his lap like a child being punished. "How could you?" I whispered. "I don't know," he said, and he sounded like he meant it. "Once I actually met you, once we started talking, once I realized you were just a real person and not just a mark, I wanted to stop. But by then we were already engaged, and the documents were ready, and my father said it was too late to back out. He said he'd destroy both of us if I didn't follow through." I sank back into the armchair. My mind was moving in slow motion, processing the past year in reverse, recontextualizing every moment. The way he'd been so quick to move in, the way he'd wanted to manage the finances, the way his father had seemed so uninterested in the wedding. None of it had been accident. None of it had been love. "Your father," I said. "The man I threw out of my wedding reception." "Yes," Brandon said. "Who looked pathetic, who everyone pitied." He was playing a part, Brandon said, just like I was. I picked up my phone and called the police. I gave them everything, the bank transfers, the fraudulent deed, the documents I'd signed. I called my lawyer, I called my parents, and they came to the house within an hour. My mother held me while I cried, and my father stood very still in the doorway, his jaw working like he was chewing glass. Brandon didn't try to run. He sat on the couch and waited for the police to arrive. When they came, he went quietly, his hands in front of him, already moving into the posture of someone who'd expected this ending all along. But the police couldn't do much without more evidence, without Michael, and Michael was nowhere to be found. I spent the next 3 weeks in a state of controlled fury. I hired a private investigator, I worked with the police, I dug through every financial record I could access, and what I found was worse than anything Brandon had told me. Michael didn't just have one mark, he had 4. Over the past 8 years, he'd orchestrated similar schemes with 4 different women. 4 of them. The first one, a woman named Deborah, had lost her entire retirement account. The second, Karen, not my boss, a different Karen, had nearly lost her house. The third, a woman named Patricia, had signed away her business. And Brandon wasn't the only son involved. Michael had another son from his first marriage, Tyler, who'd run the same con in California on a woman named Michelle. The investigator found all of this. He found the money trail, the forged documents, the pattern of manipulation. He found evidence that Michael had been training Brandon since he was 23 years old, teaching him how to identify vulnerable women, how to build trust, how to ask for financial access in ways that seemed innocent. And he found Michael's name on a property deed, a commercial real estate holding company in Phoenix, which led to another company, which led to another, which led to a portfolio worth approximately $8 million. I was sitting in my lawyer's office, a woman named Susan who had the kind of calm competence that made you feel like maybe, possibly, things could be put back together, when she told me. "He's very wealthy," Susan said, sliding a document across her desk. "Extraordinarily wealthy, decades of accumulated assets, real estate holdings, rental properties, commercial developments across Arizona and Nevada." "But he looked like he was homeless," I said. Susan smiled grimly. "Exactly. That was the point. He made himself invisible. He wore cheap clothes and drove a cheap car and made sure everyone underestimated him. It's part of the psychology. If you look successful, people are on guard. If you look pathetic, they feel sorry for you. They let you closer." I felt sick all over again. "So, when I threw him out of my wedding, he was exactly where he wanted to be," Susan finished. "You threw him out in front of 200 witnesses. You humiliated him publicly. You gave him a reason to disappear, a narrative he could use to explain why he was suddenly not around. Meanwhile, Brandon could tell you his father was so hurt by the rejection that he didn't want contact anymore." "Where is he?" I asked. "Where's Michael?" Susan pulled up a map on her computer. "As of 3 days ago, he was in Costa Rica. He's been moving money, liquidating assets. Our investigator found evidence that he's been preparing to disappear for months. He's got passports under different names, bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. He was planning his exit strategy long before you ever knew any of this was happening." I stood up and walked to the window of Susan's office. Below us, Phoenix stretched out, all glass buildings and red earth and the relentless heat. Somewhere in this city was a man who'd orchestrated the systematic financial destruction of at least 4 women, who'd groomed his own son into being a criminal, who'd made himself so invisible that nobody had suspected a thing. And he was getting away. "Can we stop him?" I asked. "We can try," Susan said, "but he's had a lot of time to plan. The question is whether you want to." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Susan said carefully, "that going after him, trying to extradite him, building a case, it's going to take years. It's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to keep you tied to this for a long time. You could take the civil settlement, recover what you can, and move forward." I turned back to look at her. "He stole my money. He stole my trust. He tried to steal my house. And you're suggesting I just let him disappear to Costa Rica and live on my money?" "No," Susan said. "I'm suggesting you consider what healing looks like for you. Sometimes it's not about vengeance. But I didn't want healing. Not yet. What I wanted was for Michael to understand what he'd done, What I wanted was for him to face what he'd created. So I went looking for him. I hired the investigator to keep tracking. I worked with federal authorities. It turned out that wire fraud across state lines was their jurisdiction, and they were interested. Very interested. I compiled documents, statements from the other women Michael had targeted, evidence of the pattern. I spent 6 weeks barely sleeping, barely eating, living on coffee and rage. And then, one morning, my phone rang. It was the FBI agent who'd been assigned to the case, a man named David Torres. "We found him," Torres said. "He's in San Jose. He was trying to set up another shell company, which is how we tracked him. We're working with Costa Rican authorities on extradition. But there's something else you should know." "What?" I asked. "The man you threw out of your wedding reception? Michael? He's been cooperating with us. He's been giving us information about his own son's activities, about the other victims, about his methods. He's hoping to get a reduced sentence." My mouth went dry. Why would he do that?" "Because," Torres said, "he realized that his son was going to testify against him anyway. Brandon's already given us everything. Michael's trying to minimize the damage. He's trying to cut a deal." I felt something crystallize inside me, some final piece of understanding that made everything else click into place. Michael had thrown Brandon under the bus, his own son, the boy he'd been grooming for years. The moment it became clear that the scheme was falling apart, Michael had turned on him without hesitation. And I had done that. My throwing him out of the wedding, my calling the police, my investigation, I had forced Michael into a corner where his only option was to betray the people he claimed to love. I didn't feel guilty about it. I felt something closer to satisfaction. 3 months later, I was sitting in a courtroom in downtown Phoenix. Michael was there, in an orange jumpsuit, his hair cut short now, his face showing the weight of everything that had happened. He looked smaller in the courtroom than he had at my wedding, more human, more fragile. The judge was explaining the charges: wire fraud, identity fraud, conspiracy, elder financial abuse in the case of one of his victims. The evidence was substantial. Brandon had testified. The other women had testified. The financial records spoke for themselves. Michael's lawyer stood up and asked if Michael wanted to make a statement. He looked at me, not at the judge, at me. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was quiet, barely audible in the courtroom. "I know that doesn't matter. I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry." I stared at him. I waited for some feeling to move through me: anger, vindication, closure. But what I felt instead was nothing. Not emptiness exactly, more like a void where I'd been expecting something to fill it. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison. He'd likely serve 8 with good behavior. The other charges would run concurrently. He'd have restitution to pay to the victims, though he'd already liquidated most of his assets trying to flee. Brandon got 3 years. He'd cooperate with authorities, which helped his case. He'd also expressed genuine remorse, which the judge seemed to find credible. He was young, the judge said. He'd been under the influence of a manipulative father. There was hope for rehabilitation. I didn't go to his sentencing. What I did do was file for divorce. I recovered 70% of what he'd stolen, thanks to the civil suit and the criminal restitution order. I sold my house and bought a smaller one closer to downtown, in a neighborhood where nobody knew me. I quit my job at the tech firm and started freelancing, which gave me more control over my schedule and my money and my life. And then, about 8 months after Michael's sentencing, something unexpected happened. I was at a coffee shop near my office, working on a client presentation, when someone sat down across from me. I looked up, and for a moment I didn't recognize her. She was older than me, maybe in her mid-50s, with tired eyes and a determined expression. "Jennifer?" she said. "Yes?" "My name is Patricia. I was one of Michael's victims. Before you. The one who lost her business." My stomach dropped. I had tried very hard not to think about the other victims. Knowing about them intellectually was one thing. Meeting one of them was something else entirely. "I wanted to thank you," Patricia said. I blinked. "What?" "For going after him. For not letting it go. For pushing the authorities to investigate. I spent 3 years thinking I was crazy. thinking I'd made a mistake, that I'd been careless with my own money, thinking I deserved what happened to me. Patricia's hands were shaking slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. And then you came forward. And suddenly, I realized I wasn't alone. I wasn't stupid. I was targeted by a professional predator. And because you were willing to fight, he's in prison now. And I can start to heal. I didn't know what to say. I'd spent the last year thinking about what I'd lost. My money, my marriage, my trust. I hadn't thought much about what my actions had given back to the other women. The validation. The sense that what had been done to them mattered. That someone cared enough to fight. He destroyed a lot of lives, Patricia continued. And now he's paying for it. Because of you. She left me her phone number and told me there was a support group if I ever wanted to join. She told me that she'd started a nonprofit to help victims of financial abuse. She told me that she was grateful. And after she left, I sat in that coffee shop for a long time, staring at my untouched coffee, trying to understand what healing actually looked like. It wasn't the absence of pain. It wasn't closure or justice or even revenge, though I'd gotten all of those things. It was something quieter, something that felt less like victory and more like the slow reconstruction of self. 6 months later, I was back in court. Not for sentencing this time, but for a hearing related to Michael's appeal. His lawyer was arguing that he'd been unfairly treated, that his cooperation should have resulted in a lighter sentence. I didn't expect anything to come of it, but I went anyway. I sat in the back of the courtroom and watched as Michael was brought in. He saw me, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or regret, or just the acknowledgement that his actions had consequences that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His appeal was denied. The judge stated that while Michael's cooperation was noted, his crimes were serious, and his victims deserved to know that there were real consequences for predatory behavior. As the bailiffs led Michael out of the courtroom, he looked back at me one more time. And I looked back at him with steady eyes. Not with hatred, not with forgiveness, just with the clear understanding that his life, like mine, had been irrevocably changed by what he'd chosen to do. I walked out of the courthouse into the Phoenix sunlight. It was late afternoon, and the heat was starting to break. I sat on a bench outside and called my mother. "How did it go?" she asked. "It went," I said. "It's over." "Are you okay?" I thought about that question for a long moment. Was I okay? I'd lost money, my marriage, my sense of security. I'd spent a year in legal battles and trauma recovery. I'd learned that people could be profoundly deceptive, that trust could be weaponized, that the person you loved could be a stranger wearing a familiar face. But I was also still here. I was also still standing. I was also still myself, just with deeper roots and harder edges, and a clearer understanding of what I could survive. "Yeah," I said finally. "I'm okay." 3 years later, I was working on a pro bono case with Patricia's nonprofit when the call came through. Michael had been released early on a technicality related to his sentencing paperwork. He was out, and nobody knew where he was. I felt the old fear spike through my chest, but it was different now. Not the paralyzing terror of someone who doesn't know what's happening to them. The focused clarity of someone who knows exactly what they're capable of facing. I called Torres, the FBI agent. I called my lawyer. I made sure my security was tight. And then I waited. He never came for me. Apparently, he'd left Arizona entirely, moved to Nevada, was working under an assumed name at a casino in Reno. He was staying invisible, staying small, staying away from anything that might draw attention. I understood then that Michael had learned something from his time in prison. He'd learned that some people would fight, that some women wouldn't just disappear quietly into the background of their own destruction, that there were consequences to underestimating the people you hurt. I never saw him again. But I knew he was out there, living a diminished life, looking over his shoulder, understanding on some level that the world had shifted, that the invisible predator had become the one who had to hide. And that, I realized, was enough. On a Tuesday morning, 5 years after my wedding day, I was making coffee in my kitchen when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Patricia. "Thought you should know. Michael died last week. Heart attack in his apartment in Reno. Alone. No family showed up for the funeral. I read the message 3 times. Then I deleted it. Then I poured my coffee and sat at my kitchen table and watched the morning light move across the wall. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel happy. I felt the strange peace of someone who had survived something that was meant to destroy her and had come out the other side not broken, but rebuilt. Stronger. Clearer about what mattered. The coffee was hot and bitter and perfect. And for the first time in 5 years, I drank it without flinching.